I want to prefix this video by stating that I, and most other people criticizing Thunderfoot's videos on SpaceX, are not Elon fanboys, in spite of what Thunderfoot would have you believe.
It's stunning that anyone would defend him at all, let alone there to be an army of people who will vigorously defend him. So the Musk fans had three main grievances.
I would also like to say that SpaceX is absolutely worthy of criticism. No one is saying that it isn't, and most SpaceX fans agree with this. There are very obvious criticisms of SpaceX to be made that Thunderfoot bizarrely doesn't, but I'll tie into that a bit later. It's also worth mentioning that it's no secret Thunderfoot has a bit of a vendetta against Musk and likes to make fantastic use of old memes.
Surely that's just not possible. This is what it looks like. Being dumb in the Olympics dumb. There just aren't enough facepalm memes.
That being said, let's get to the video. So Thunderfoot has made two videos about SpaceX, and they seem misguided in their message. An obvious symptom of that is the numbers he comes up with. A quick example of this selective research, aka cherry picking, would be Thunderfoot saying that a NASA engineer said launch costs went up with SpaceX, while on the other page of the report he's quoting, another NASA engineer says that costs didn't change.
And I'm not the first to notice this either. You know, NASA guys have actually said that when they decommissioned the shuttle and contracted things out with SpaceX, their launch costs actually went up.
Another YouTuber by the name of Dr. Knows-It-All went quite in depth with the numbers. So I'm going to go into a bit more depth about some of the other points Thunderfoot tries to make. And this brings me to my first major gripe with Thunderfoot's two videos on SpaceX.
This is awkward. The third quarter of this video hasn't aged well. Actually, it's aged amazingly well. So yeah, this is impressive, but it should be kept in perspective as an incremental development in rocket science. And just like with other concepts of reusable spacecraft, it remains to be seen if this is going to be a profitable.
So in that clip, Thunderfoot is talking about a comment he made back in 2016 when SpaceX first landed their booster on a drone ship. His subtitles then say that it was a prediction about whether or not you can break even with reuse, while both Musk and Dr. Know-It-All have said that reuse is profitable after only 2 to 3 launches.
If you look here at a 0.1% or 10% additional cost per rocket and 60% of the payload that an expendable rocket can manage, not 50% by the way, we get a break even at about 2 launches, and every subsequent launch saves more and more money. At the 6th launch landing number, which is being achieved today, costs are below half of an expendable rocket. That's pretty significant and will go up if they can manage to reuse them more.
Then he shows this bogus chart of the expected launch costs of SpaceX. Now, the cost of launch to the customer doesn't really have that much to do with how profitable reuse is for SpaceX, as these comments state.
On to the last of the grievances of the Elon Musk fans, which was that he really is doing it loads cheaper. It's just he keeps charging people lots of money because he wants to make profit, and he only has to undercharge relative to his competitors to still be the best in the market, which is awesome because there are no public figures on this. You've got to go via the only numbers that are available, which are things like their contracts and were taken with a pinch of salt, the SpaceX numbers. Why taken with a pinch of salt? Well, you'll remember earlier that Elon Musk claimed that he was digging tunnels 100 times cheaper than anyone else in the world. You actually checked those costs for digging the tunnel versus everyone else's costs for digging tunnels, and they were exactly the same as everyone else's.
Now, these are good points. Why would SpaceX reduce their price further despite them already being the cheapest on the market? Not to mention that the cost to the customer absolutely does not reflect how much it costs SpaceX to launch reflown boosters, but apparently the Boring Company's tunnel wasn't as cheap as they said. So this perfectly reasonable explanation of why SpaceX's launch costs to the customer haven't gone down is just completely moot because the tunnel not cheap. Right.
And if you take a look at their claimed costs about refurbishing their rockets, it's about comparable with running expendable rockets.
Now, it took me a second to find this article, which makes sense considering it's almost 4 years old. But here it is. So SpaceX President Gwynne Shotwell said that the cost for refurbishing the very first Falcon 9 booster to be reused, SES-10, was substantially less than half what it would have cost to build a brand new booster. Now, substantially less than half is already a monumental saving in terms of spaceflight. But Shotwell goes on to say that cost savings would only go up, since after all this was the first of their boosters to be refurbished, so obviously the process would be streamlined to be cheaper and quicker. This was also before SpaceX started recovering their fairings, which would reduce the costs even more. As I showed earlier, the cost of refurbishing a Falcon 9 rocket is less than 10% the cost of building a new one, as of August 2020. Not half like Thunderf00t says here. So the best Thunderf00t could do for busting SpaceX's refurbishment costs and owning the scam artist Elon Musk who steals taxpayer money for himself is an article from 4 years ago about how much it cost SpaceX to refurbish and refly their very first Falcon 9 rocket. That's lazy at best and purposefully deceptive at worst.
Look, I couldn't find any decent breakdown of launch costs, but I did find this one from United Launch Alliance, and it feels to be in the right ballpark, which is give or take 1/3 of the costs go to running the launch facility and the infrastructure and the personnel and all that sort of thing. Well, if this is true, then your SpaceX launch looks something like this. 1/3 of it can't be reduced because that's what you've got to run anyway. And Musk says his second stage, which isn't reusable, is about 20% of the cost of the rockets, or thereabouts. Even if all you have to do is roll up and add more fuel to your rockets, you can only reduce your costs by about another 50%. And, realistically, drone ships, shipping costs, transport costs, and people to run it all are not trivial costs. Nor is checking that the booster is fit to fly again. And because reusable rockets only launch about 70% of the mass to orbit that expendable ones do, this means that if you actually get over the 70% line here at any point, that's not break even anymore. You're better off just using expendable rockets.
Here are the numbers. The total launch cost is 60 million, even though in reality it's around 50 million for a reflown booster. We're talking percentages here, so it doesn't really matter. By Thunderf00t's numbers, the ground costs are 1/3, second stage costs are 20%, and refurbishment costs are 10%, as Musk stated. So there's actually a pretty decent margin there, keeping in mind that these numbers are a worst case scenario for SpaceX, since a large amount of the ground costs in this graph are in reality already covered by the refurbishment costs, like transport of the rocket, for example. Not to mention that the whole 1/3 of the total cost is ground cost thing comes from ULA, not SpaceX, so we're not exactly comparing apples to apples here. Speaking of refurbishment costs, they have been rumored to be as low as 0.4% the total cost of launch, increasing the margin even more. So Thunderf00t then goes on a bit of a tangent and points out a whole bunch of things that are either irrelevant or not true.
Look, in science we look for this thing called concordance, which is where you get multiple different lines of reasoning that end up independently in the same region. And if you get concordance from multiple lines of reasoning, you have more confidence in that conclusion.
So let's go through them one by one. Cost for human launch similar to the shuttle? No. No SpaceX claims of a dramatic decrease in costs. Frankly, they don't need to. The customer launch costs, the share SpaceX has of the market, the launch frequency, these all speak for themselves. Competitors' analysts say reuse is marginal. This is irrelevant for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's a competitor of SpaceX. They're not exactly going to be singing the praises of a rival company. And for another important reason that I will get into later in this video, program costs that are similar to the shuttle. Again, program costs, especially total program costs divided by kg delivered to orbit, aren't exactly relevant. Even if they were, the Falcon 9 is still much cheaper than the shuttle. SpaceX estimates close to break even, referring to the infamous green bar from earlier. No. Break even is 2 to 3 launches for the Falcon 9, as we know from, again, this Elon tweet. And nowadays it is expected for each new booster to at least double the number of break-even launches. No obvious reduction in launch costs. So this ties back into why SpaceX hasn't reduced their launch cost for customers, which I covered earlier in this video. Previous reusable craft marginal. A real apples to apples comparison. From an engineering standpoint, the shuttle and Crew Dragon are almost identical. Fantastic point there, mate. Check out this video from Everyday Astronaut if you want more information on the differences between the shuttle and Crew Dragon. Furthermore, the quickest refurbishment time for a Falcon 9 booster is only 27 days and can cost as low as $250,000 for just the booster. Whereas for the shuttle, the quickest refurbishment time was 54 days and refurb costs were in the tens of millions for just the orbiter. And if you think that sounds irrelevant, it is, but I wasn't the one who brought it up. And finally, the NASA payload engineer saying that it costs more. No. As I said at the start of the video, on the very next page, another engineer said that the costs stayed similar, and called the numbers from the previous engineer's report garbage. After making these points, Thunderfoot then goes back to his usual Musk-bashing formula.
Half a dozen different lines of reasoning put SpaceX in the same ballpark as other human-rated vessels, and that reusability is not a magic bullet here. Certainly not the magic bullet that's going to make things 100 times cheaper. Yeah, I'm sure SpaceX is perfectly competitive, but it's not revolutionary. Flying dustbins really aren't that impressive.
Now, the term revolutionary is pretty subjective, though I do find it ironic that he shows the Starship prototype right after he says this, which will undoubtedly be revolutionary. Look, the bottom line is this: if reuse wasn't worth it for SpaceX, they wouldn't do it. There's nothing stopping them from taking the grid fins and landing legs off their rockets, just like they do for the center core of Falcon Heavy when it's used in expendable mode. If the margin is as thin as Thunderfoot claims it to be, they could easily adapt their fleet of Falcons into expendable boosters, but they don't. If reuse of a first stage was such a waste of time and
should be kept in perspective as an incremental development in rocket design,
then how come SpaceX is so damn cheap? They currently offer the cheapest ride to space for humans and is one of, if not the cheapest, depending on payload characteristics, rides to space for payload. If the reuse margins were so thin, why would China, Russia, India, Japan, ULA, ESA, Blue Origin, and Rocket Lab twice now all be pursuing reusability? Thunderfoot isn't just saying Elon Musk and SpaceX is wrong. He's saying that all of these other companies and space agencies who have all run their own numbers and all think reuse is the way to go are wrong as well, and that his math is better than theirs. He seems to mistakenly think that profitable reusable rockets are just the pipe dream of Elon Musk, who he hates so vehemently.
Oh, wait, hang on. That's right. Beautifully rendered animations. One of the largest red flags of bullshit merchants.
Crew Dragon, or Dragon 2, is SpaceX's first human-rated spacecraft and was originally designed to carry astronauts and civilians into low Earth orbit and return them using the Super Draco engines mounted on the side of the capsule to propulsively land back on Earth, using parachutes as a backup in case the engines failed or if there was an abort during launch. SpaceX decided to forego the propulsive landing and use parachutes and a splashdown to recover the capsule from orbit instead. They did this for a number of reasons, but mainly because it was unlikely NASA would ever give the green light to a propulsive lander for crewed flight, which in my opinion was actually a good call. SpaceX did keep the engines in their design and were to be used in the event of an abort as shown here. Red Dragon was a plan to launch a Dragon capsule to Mars atop a Falcon Heavy rocket and have it propulsively land, but this was cancelled in July 2017. The reason for this basically boiled down to SpaceX not wanting to have to human rate Falcon Heavy or to human rate Dragon for propulsive landing, but mainly because Starship would make Red Dragon obsolete. So they decided to dedicate their resources to Starship development instead. Now, there are absolutely criticisms of Dragon to be made. Examples would be the fact it carries its abort engines and highly toxic hypergolic fuels with it the entire way through re-entry, and that it splashes down in a saltwater ocean, making refurbishment more difficult and expensive, whereas Boeing's Starliner uses airbags to land on dry land. That being said, Starliner does cost $5 million more than even the space shuttle per seat. Maybe that's a topic for another video. If Thunderf00t did a spit of research into Red Dragon, he would know why it was cancelled in favour of Starship. Check out this other Everyday Astronaut video on that topic, but he spends a good chunk of his video talking about it anyway.
Wow, that's a strong case for propulsive landings, that they can land anywhere in the entire solar system, and they've now had over 5 years to work it all out with. They must be really good at this by now. You know what would be really kind of humiliating? Is if the Dragon capsules now used a method for landing that was worked out over 50 years ago by people with slide rules.
If you thought Thunderf00t's criticisms of SpaceX's reuse are ridiculous, just wait until you hear what he has to say about SpaceX's Crew Dragon.
Yeah, I can't but out feel that I've seen this all somewhere before in some archaic, grainy, vintage film shot a long time before I was born. In fact, in form factor, the Dragon capsule is basically a clone of the command module. Again, a 50-odd-year-old space vehicle.
That's right, the Dragon capsule is a clone of the Apollo command module. Despite the fact truncated cones are literally the most stable capsule designs and all currently flying capsules today use them, SpaceX must be ripping off all of these other capsules. There's a reason that every capsule, with the exception of the very early Soviet Vostok and Voskhod capsules, use a truncated cone design. That's basic hypersonic flight dynamics, not Elon ripping off Apollo of all things. By that same logic, Apollo ripped off Soyuz, which also ripped off Gemini, which originally ripped off Mercury. Scott Manley goes into much more detail in his video about heat shields.
Except, of course, the command module could take it to the moon. Yeah, food, water, all that sort of thing for a couple of weeks. It was capable of navigating on its own and, if necessary, completing its mission on its own.
Okay, so the Apollo command module could finish its mission on its own if it had to. Great. So can Dragon 2. Why the hell would you even bring that up? The first ever Dragon 2 in space completed its mission by itself. I mean, what the fuck? Also, if SpaceX wanted to send Dragon to the moon, they could, but it isn't designed for that. It's only designed to spend, let's see, at least 210 days in low Earth orbit. In fact, one of the downsides to both the Apollo command module and the space shuttle is that their mission life was limited by the hydrogen fuel cells they had on board, which used hydrogen and oxygen to create electricity, meaning that the longest shuttle flight ever was only 17.5 days. So after that whole spiel, Thunderf00t then says that the interior of the Dragon capsule gives you the feel of an oversized Coke can.
When you look at the interior of the Dragon capsule, you get the feel of an oversized Coke can. A very, very Spartan oversized Coke can.
That's right, folks. He showed a picture of the incomplete mock-up Dragon 2 that was used at the unveiling event for Dragon 2 way back in 2014. The mock-up, without interior paneling. That's like showing the interior of an airliner without its final paneling and saying, "Ah, well, that looks like the inside of a Coke can." Here's what the inside of Dragon 2 actually looks like. Unfortunately, a Thunderf00t response to my criticism or the criticism of Dr. Know-It-All will probably never happen. It's far easier to talk about copyright than it is to admit you were wrong about something. My guess is Thunderf00t will milk the shit out of this copyright claim business and then pretend these two SpaceX videos never happened. We most likely won't get anything closer to a response than this tweet in reply to Scott Manley. And you bet your ass I'll make another video about the Starship video he released while I was editing this. So Thunderf00t and his fans can keep stroking their massive hate boners for Musk, and SpaceX can keep doing what they do. Honestly, I find the channels that add well-researched criticism to their videos more impressive, and not so much the ones that add bright red neon in their thumbnails. But his fans clearly lap this stuff up. Oh well. As Dr. Knows-It-All said, someone has to watch The Watchmen.